Mic check 1 2. Mic check 1 2. Can anybody hear me? Can anybody see me? Welcome to another special episode on the RealToughCandy channel of Fish Fry Friday with a special guest. Audience, let me know if you can hear me. I have with me today Tech Rally. He is a working senior developer. We're going to pick his brain. We're going to have a one-on-one conversation, and then we're going to go over to the comments that everyone has, questions that people have for him. If you can hear us, let us know. Mic check. Wildflower, hey. Ayan Y, what's up? All right, we already have 9 people in the chat here. I'm going to introduce to you. I'm not going to waste any time with all these promos and plugs and stuff. What's up, Vlaslo? Paradoodly, Rebecca, hey. All right, I would like to introduce to you the one, the only Tech Rally. What's up, Tech Rally?
Hey, how are you doing?
Good. Can you guys out in YouTube land see him? Let me just see if this is working here. I don't want any Super Bowl style technical difficulties here. Let me just see on the video.
I'm looking at the YouTube video on the side. Oh, there I am. Oh yeah, I guess I do show up. It's just a little lag.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. So I have Tech Rally on. He has his own YouTube channel. I'm going to stop blabbering on. Why don't you introduce yourself and then we'll go from there.
Yeah. So my name is, I guess, Tech Rally, or Alex for short, for my actual name. And I've been a software developer for about 5 years now. And before that, I was working as a mechanical engineer. I started my coding journey by attending a coding bootcamp school in New York City called Flatiron School. And after that, I got a job 3 months later and worked at that job for about 8 to 9 months. And then I transitioned into my current position as a senior developer, mostly focused on the front end. And on my free time, I like to create YouTube content, help out aspiring developers, and yeah, just try to give them any kind of knowledge that I wish I had when I was learning how to code. So, and now I'm here.
Awesome. So you said mechanical, you were a mechanical engineer before you became a developer. What made you transition from mechanical engineering to software development?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I graduated around 2011, and it's about 3 years after the whole market drop and everything. So finding a job was very difficult for me. And I just basically took whatever gave me the first option. And I've worked there for about 3 years, specifically in the semiconductor manufacturing industry. And honestly, it was kind of a couple of steps backwards, because even though I was working and getting paid, I wasn't learning anything new. It was just understanding a system. And I felt like my brain was just on autopilot.
Mm-hmm.
So I realized I needed to make a change in my life. And that's how I just kind of discovered software development on YouTube, actually.
Okay.
And there's always that joke about the Bucky Roberts, but that was my era as well. That's how I learned how to code in the beginning, and kind of transitioned from then to trying to make that into a career.
Yeah, because not even just like a few short years ago, it was Bucky Roberts and that was it. There was a time when there was no Traversy Media, these smaller channels really weren't heard of. It was Bucky, he was the godfather of YouTube tutorials and web development and stuff. And the tuna sandwich example, when you say tuna sandwich, Bucky Roberts, people are like, yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. So
yeah, exactly. It was just, I mean, he pretty much pioneered the whole YouTube tutorial series. And I think definitely Traversy Media took the baton pass from there. But yeah, they're both really good at what they do.
So you're on YouTube, you're poking around online. What made you choose a boot camp rather than go completely self-taught?
Yeah, that's another great question. Well, first of all, I was working at my current company for about 3 years. So a part of me just knew I wanted to leave. And then the second thing is, and this is all kind of a unique case-by-case situation for each person, but for me, I found that time was a lot more valuable than the money, because I did save enough money to make sure I could survive while I lived in New York City, right?
Right.
So I just had to manage my money very well. But for me, if it was possible to become a software developer in 3 months, as long as I put in the work, I felt like that was such a better opportunity than potentially going to grad school, spending 2 years of my time and not knowing what that future might entail. So And if I actually really didn't like software engineering, all I did was spend 3 months on it, and then I could just move on to my next endeavor.
Right. So this boot camp was in New York City. Were you living in you said you were living in New York City at the time?
No, so crazy enough, I was living in Austin at that time,
Okay.
and I was working there. But one thing that was kind of nice about my time when attending a bootcamp school was there wasn't that many to choose from. So the research and comparing, like I just saw your Discord chat about someone that got accepted into 5 boot camps, and there's just so many different ways to think about it. But for me, there was only a few. There was one like Dev Bootcamp, Maker Square, Flatiron School. So there wasn't many options. So
Right.
the amount of research that was required to look into these boot camps was not that many. And for me, just I know you probably know my personality, but I just like to take chances and check off something on my bucket list, like starting a YouTube channel. So for me, moving to New York was on my bucket list, and I just wanted to start my new career there.
Cool. Did you love New York, or what were your thoughts when you went from Austin to New York?
Yeah, that was a crazy transition because I moved to New York in March or like February around that time. And I have no snowshoes whatsoever. All I had were Converses. So when I landed in New York City, literally I got in front of my Airbnb, took 2 steps, and I stumbled upon a huge pool of water. And I was like, yes, this is truly New York City. So it was a great transition from a place that has relatively warm weather to having all 4 seasons.
Right. Your boot camp, if I'm not mistaken, it teaches Ruby on Rails. Is that correct?
Yeah, so 2015, it was strictly Ruby on Rails with very, very small amounts of JavaScript and
Oh,
jQuery.
okay.
But my company, we've hired graduates from Flatiron School, and they've definitely changed their curriculum to match to what the employers are looking for. So now they do have a blend of backend Ruby on Rails with some Sinatra, and on the front end, they focus on React development.
Okay. So when you were enrolled, you said it was like a 3 month boot camp, like, yeah, 12, 13 weeks. Was there any time during that process where you're like, oh my gosh, what have I done? Did you ever kind of assess that maybe this was a bad decision or a good decision, or what were you feeling going through boot camp?
Yeah, I mean, I think imposter syndrome is inevitable for anybody attending this kind of curriculum or this kind of journey that you're taking. But one thing that is nice about the boot camp experience was that you're around other peers that are in the same shoes as you. And what I mean by that is a lot of my peers were people that had jobs before, and they're trying to make that career switch, not necessarily, and nothing against someone coming right out of a college to attend a boot camp, but in a way, like the misery loves company. Like we all kind of hated our previous jobs, so we were
Right,
all
right.
pushing each other to make sure that we were successful in our next chapter. So yeah, there were times we felt that we weren't ready. That's just inevitable, but you got to take that chance. And one thing that was super nice, and I don't know if they do it anymore, is we had this thing called Feelings Friday. So what you do is at the end of each week, you sit down in a circle and you talk about your struggles, and everyone it just helps other people relate to you. So the struggle is real, and everyone's kind of going through the same process as you.
It's like a therapeutic sharing of.
Exactly.
Okay. Okay, so when you got out of boot camp and you have all this knowledge, you go to your first dev job, or you go to your place of employment. What were the biggest differences you noticed your first week at the job outside of boot camp versus actually being in boot camp?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference is that you really have to know how to use Git very well. And another thing is it is a production level code base. So when you're in a coding boot camp, and going back to the Ruby on Rails comparison, you may only have like 3 to 5 models for your portfolio project or whatever project you're working on, but somehow that gets amplified to like 15 models and crazy amount of controllers. It's just a lot more amplified.
Mm.
But at the same time, you're around a lot more experienced developers who know what they're doing. So it's a give and take. Yeah, it is a lot more ambitious of a project for sure, but at the same time, you're around people that are experienced that know what they're doing.
Okay. Is there stuff you learned, whether on your own or in boot camp, that you never use on the job? Like, what are some things you learned that you're just never going to apply? And is there a lot of that kind of stuff, or do you use most of what you've learned in the past?
That's a great question. So my boot camp consisted of Ruby and Ruby on Rails and very little JavaScript. Now I do pretty much 100% JavaScript. So it really shows you that, your first language, as important as it is, it may not be your primary language at the end. So for me, I just found an affinity towards the front end development. And if you do front end development, you're going to have to know JavaScript. So I took a lot of Udemy classes after I got my job because I knew that 3 months of training, as ambitious as it was to do it every day, 12 hours a day, it still wasn't going to be enough to really just be settled with that kind of skill. So I definitely took I definitely took resources outside of my job to make sure I learn and make sure I'm up to date with a lot of these new technologies. And
Okay.
actually, I was able to get my next job after my first job because of a Udemy course that I took on React, and I was just really into it. And then I got pretty much hired because of my React skills, which I didn't
Nice.
learn at the coding bootcamp.
Got to know, what Udemy course was it? What React course?
So I'm a huge fan of Stephen Grider. I know we don't talk about it too much, but he is, to me, very easy to follow. He just explains it very, very well, and he's someone I really look up to in terms of when I want to make a course. I want to make it very simple and very easily digestible.
Okay. And so you took just by that course, you taught yourself React and you were able to take those skills. So Udemy does work. Like, the courses are cheap, they're easy to access, but they actually help people learn and land jobs. So it's good to hear, because sometimes it feels like you're in like a hamster wheel sometimes with self-taught learning. Like, 500 Udemy courses later, you still feel like you're at level zero. But if you apply them, like, did you have to add projects to your portfolio from that course, or what specifically did that course do for you as far as teaching you React? Just the whole ecosystem, or?
Yeah, I think I have a hard time trying to explain this to new and aspiring developers about taking Udemy courses because from my perspective, when I took it, I had somewhat experience of learning how to code. But generally, when new and aspiring developers take a Udemy course, they're kind of starting from scratch. And
Right.
sometimes that they don't know how to transition from learning to applying. And and for me, in terms of React, I just was learning what I needed to know to become a better front end developer. So I didn't necessarily make too many portfolio projects, but one of those things that I got really lucky with is at my previous job, they asked me to build something in React. So I got to apply what I learned in the work that I was working at. And then I transitioned into my new job by mostly working on that as well. So kind of lucked out in that way.
Cool. So as a junior, I mean, everyone starts out as a junior, as a code newbie at the beginning stages. Where do you think that that status ends? Where does a junior developer become a mid-level developer, and where does a mid-level become a senior?
Right. From the junior to mid, I really feel that when you start off as a junior, I kind of need to have some kind of supervision over you, whether it's more thorough code reviews, more pair programming, things like that. And from junior to mid, it's one of those times where I just kind of leave you alone and say, you work on this project that you're assigned to. You could ask me for help here and there, but this is going to be your project. And I want you to make sure you get from start to finish. And by the time that I see your project, it's just going to be at the end in the code review. From mid to senior, I think the biggest difference between a mid to senior level developer is you have to start thinking a lot more rather than coding. And what I mean by that is how do you scale your applications, whether it's the front end or the back end, and things like architecture, performance, DevOps, things like that is what really differentiates from a mid-level to a level developer. So mid-level developers, you don't really need as much supervision, but you're also just working on maybe product related features. And then the senior level developer, and then that kind of goes into like the principal or the staff engineer, they're really thinking about the long game. How do we make sure our company succeeds when we go from 100 users to 1 million users and things like that?
Okay. So as a senior, what do a typical day in the life of a senior developer. I'm just, because we get, this channel is targeted towards newbies and people coming into the industry. We really don't talk about the mid-level and senior stuff on a day-to-day basis. What can I expect Tech Rally to be doing?
Right. So I'll just give you an example of what I'm kind of working on right now. We're going through a huge transition phase in that we're changing a lot of how our backend works in terms of like how the API is returned to us. So what I mean by that is how the data is returned to the front end. And with that big change on the back end, the front end has to make all of these adjustments, like all of the code that you were writing previously that was working is now suddenly breaking. And instead of just fixing it automatically or fixing it right away, you have to start thinking about like, how do we make sure that the code we write is scalable and not fragile, right? So a lot of times these days, I'm mostly spending time just coming up with an ideas or design docs, things like that, that I could present to the front end team. And based on the design doc approval process and things like that, that's when I start to code. Another thing that I do is also do semi one-on-ones with some of the junior level developers. I ask them how they're doing, like what they're working on, what they're struggling with. I wouldn't say I'm necessarily like a manager, but it is a lot less coding than what I used to do, where I was just kind of like grinding it out from the beginning. But I still do a lot more thinking about coding than coding itself.
Sure, absolutely. All right, developers, if you're just joining us, we are talking with Tech Rally. He has a YouTube channel. He's a senior developer. We are going to be going to the audience in a few minutes here, about 5 o'clock. We'll hand the mic over to the audience. I see I got a super chat from William. Thanks for that. We'll go to your question. But I still have a few questions I got to ask this guy.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So let's talk about, now that you've been in the industry for some years now, you're managing junior developers, you're probably mentoring them and pointing them in the right direction. What advice can you give for people watching who are new to the industry and just looking to succeed? Like, should they be spending more time learning? Should they be spending more time working on their portfolio? Like, what are some big components that juniors and aspiring developers need to be focusing on?
Man, I've been thinking about this for many, many months. And especially once I started my YouTube channel, it's like, how do I teach what's in my head, but it's hard to come out, right? And to me, I think there's a few things. I think the first one is just be patient. I think a lot of times people want to become a software developer in 2 weeks or 1 month, and they're working full time. It's just, I did it. It took me 3 months to get a junior position, and I was in a software boot camp. But
Right.
I think you kind of have to be a little bit more like realistic about what your end game is and how you're going to get there. And that kind of goes to my second point is don't just learn code for the sake of learning code. I know I talked about this in my last video about React, Vue, or Angular. Yeah, at the end of the day, it really doesn't matter. You just got to choose a framework that is going to get you the job, right? And sometimes I think people spend too much time thinking and not actually doing. So the one thing is just make sure you stay focused on your goals. And what I was thinking one might be a good strategy is kind of think backwards. Like, what is your goal? Your goal is to become a software engineer or junior software engineer. And then you think backwards, like, how do I get to that position? Like, don't get distracted by the Dinos or things like that. Be more focused on like understanding your JavaScript fundamentals, then doing your HTML and CSS. Maybe pick one framework for the front end and back end, and just try to find the minimal amount of resources that you need to get you that first position. And I think you're a big proponent of, I forgot his name, the Zero to Mastery.
Oh, Andre Negoe.
Yeah, Andre Negoe. I actually listened to his podcast interview, and he was talking about how his course is not meant for you to become the best software engineer by the time you land your first job. It's knowing just enough to get that first job, and you'll do your learning afterwards.
Right. Yeah, like that's like I think of the first year working, getting a paycheck, whatever you're doing, whether it's freelancing or in enterprise or in a startup, that first year is pretty much like an internship plus, where you're doing work, but you're also getting paid to do it, and you're learning more than anything. And so like after, that 8 to 12 month mark, it's like, okay, now I'm actually getting some confidence and I'm able to contribute more. But I think for me anyways, I was expecting myself to just rush right into a code base and fix it, or do this all this magical stuff. But that's really not the goal. If someone's hiring you as a junior, as a beginner, like they know they're paying you less because they know you're going to be learning more and doing less than a mid-level or a senior, but you're still contributing in some way. So yeah, I think I do see some developers kind of getting this anxiety of like, oh my gosh, I don't know this or I don't know that. It's just something to learn, and you're going to learn it, whether it's before you start working or on the job. Like the information is out there, and it just takes a little time. So
Right.
it's
And
nothing to be anxious about or panicked about.
right, I completely agree. I know. So, I mean, some people fall in one of two spectrums where they either rush it or they don't want to take that leap. Right. Some people, they're just stuck in tutorial hell and they don't know how to apply what they learned to projects, but they're too scared to do it. But you just got to do it. And even with YouTube in general, like how I first started, I was too scared to even talk in front of a camera. But here I am now doing a live stream with you and just taking these like chances. And I think a lot of times people's fear people don't do it because of their own fear and not necessarily because they're not skilled enough, right? So
Mhm.
yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's go over. We're gonna first of all, this guy's got a YouTube channel. Developers, Paradoodly Doo or Sarah, who are both our mods today. If one of you could put his channel in the chat so people can check it out. Before we go to the audience questions, talk a little bit about your channel. Like, what made you start it? What do you focus on your channel?
Right. So originally when I first started, I just wanted to check off another thing on my bucket list of starting a YouTube channel. And honestly, I didn't care if it was 5 subscribers, 10 subscribers. It was something that I just had a fear of just kind of showing myself to the world through the internet. So it was one of those things where I just wanted to see what would happen if I do it. And I kind of stayed in my element of just writing or talking about tutorials or talking about code itself. So if you notice, like in the beginning of my videos, it's all very tutorial based. But then as I started to gain more confidence about myself, I was basically just talking about my experience as a developer. And essentially, what I want to get out of this channel is I want to help aspiring developers become developers at the end of the day, or junior developers to become mid to become senior. And if the, I am constantly thinking about what are people looking for, what do people want to know, because sometimes I realize that as a senior developer or someone that's been 5 years out of starting my coding journey, I don't know how the landscape has changed. So a lot of times I'm asking questions to my friends like, hey, what do you need? What are you looking for? And that's how I kind of more or less come up with my topics. And I kind of research here and there on the Odin project, free code camp forums to see what people are struggling with. And I hope that I can translate that into my videos and answer any questions that a lot of people might have.
Awesome. Okay, I have one more question for you, and then we're going to go to the audience questions.
Sure, sure.
How has learning changed for you now as a senior compared to when you were an aspiring developer?
I think as an aspiring developer, I had an dependency on tutorials and only working with tutorials. And as a senior developer, I just read documentation now.
Mm.
So for example, like I'm learning Svelte.js and I'm actually trying to build a course on it. But originally how I learned was not through some Udemy class by Max. I forgot his last name either, but I'm not using his courses or anything to learn Svelte. I'm just reading the documentation and just kind of going my way and understanding how the application works. And it's because I have enough experience as a developer to like know the ins and outs of like, oh, you'll make a mistake here or you'll make a mistake there. It honestly is like, how do you make an application in another way? Is it ABC or is it ACB or CB? It's more or less the same thing, but you just kind of figure out different nuances with each framework.
Right.
And the second thing that I realize I do a lot more is I read my errors. As a new developer, it's really hard to just be like, oh, why is my app breaking? And a lot of times you more focus on why, and kind of complain about the why. But if you just breathe a little bit and actually look at what the error is and you read it, you go, okay, I know why this is breaking. So a lot more times I've definitely calmed down about code. And at the end of the day, code doesn't have a personality. It's not mad at you for any reason. it's just code. So you just breathe and just read what the error is, and then you just solve it. Yeah.
I love how you say that, because I know too, like there are some days when I'm just like, ah, just like flipping tables and going berserk. It's just like, calm down and just Google the error. It's not that serious. Like because I think when I was starting out, especially, it can be really dejecting, like error after error. Thinking like, what am I doing wrong? But this is just, it's part of the process, and it's part of any application. Like the default is broken. So, our biggest job is to fix those. Well, one of the biggest jobs we have is to fix those errors, and just, like you said, calm down, take a deep breath. I know and just like deep breathing really does help. Like,
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think that's the one thing about the fallacy of like tutorials is that when you follow tutorials, you never run into errors. And
right?
I think when people start applying what they learned, they're like, oh my God, I'm hitting so many errors. I'm not a good developer. And the reality is that even the instructors have probably hit so many errors. They just don't show it to you.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. If they did the course unedited, it would be double or triple that time. Like they've been editing heavily their
Right.
tutorials and stuff.
And that kind of relates to being patient, right? Like, don't worry about spending 3 hours on some small bug. I mean, that in a way is learning, and it's better to learn firsthand experience than just through a tutorial and be like, oh, I just know the happy path of how to do React or do Vue or whatever.
Right. Absolutely great advice. Okay, let's switch over to the audience now. Developers, I'm talking with Tech Rally. He's a senior developer. He has a lot to share. He has his own YouTube channel and he's rocking it. Ask him anything. We're going to open up the chat now. We have a super chat from William Claybrook. Thanks, William, for that. He wants to know, why is imposter syndrome important? I never understood that. Recipes are made to be copied and adjusted.
Why is imposter syndrome? What was the actual question? Why is imposter syndrome? What?
Why is imposter syndrome important?
Why is it imposter? I think imposter syndrome is it important? I don't know. I think imposter syndrome is important in a way that it acknowledges that, you can't be too confident as a developer. And what I mean by that is there are some developers that are too confident and, they're just a really pain to work with. But the reality is I still am a junior developer in my own way. I work like a junior developer in my head. So like when someone asks me a question and I obviously know the answer, I try to be more empathetic towards that person, right? Because I was in those shoes. So maybe I'm not understanding the exact question correctly, but yeah, like imposter syndrome is always going to happen no matter what you do, right? Either video, like for me right now, I have imposter syndrome with video editing and just assuming that like my videos aren't going to be as good as those other tech YouTubers out there. But once you overcome those imposter syndrome mentalities, it really does help you evolve and become a better at whatever you decide to do.
And the thing is too, this career field is just so massive. And I think a lot of it comes from the fact that there's not two people doing the exact same thing. Like there's people working with frameworks, there's people doing back-end development, they're working on node projects, PHP, like computers are so infinite. And so when you realize it's a rabbit hole that you can't get out of, like there's no end to it, it does become so overwhelming. And even now, like people talk about stuff that I've never heard of, technologies I've never worked with, and this is the same career field. So it's like, I've never heard of that. Like we're vibing, but it's just like, there are literally millions of things to learn in this career field. So it's just so easy to get overwhelmed. But niching down and just, okay, maybe I can get good at, let's just focus on HTML and do it that way. And I feel like, at least for me, when I reeled back and I kind of niched down and focused on one technology instead of focusing on the fact that it was infinite, it helped me, it lessened my anxiety and just helped me become a better developer because I could focus on just one tech rather than 500,000.
Right. I completely agree. And I think that's the biggest difference between senior developer Alex now and aspiring developer Alex then was I think I care too much about all these emerging technologies. For me right now, I don't do Golang. I don't do too much backend development. I could make APIs, don't get me wrong, but that's not what I enjoy doing, and I'm okay with that.
Right.
And there shouldn't be some kind of urgency to always be doing everything, right? find what you enjoy about coding and stick with it. It's not going to get obsolete. And actually, the funny thing is I think one of the skills that is super underrated is CSS. And I know a lot of brilliant backend developers that can't do any type of CSS whatsoever. So it's really funny that, like, people have their own specialty, and you just got to stick with what you enjoy. I think that's the most important part.
All right, moving on. Paradoodly Doo, thanks for the super chat. Para wants to know, well, you kind of mentioned it, but we can go into a little more. What's your course going to be on?
Yeah, it's still in the works. I'm basically just laying it out right now. It's gonna be a course on Svelte development. And I did that intentionally, where I don't want beginner developers to take this course, because I know this is kind of going against the grain of trying to make more money, but the reality is there's not as many jobs looking for Svelte developers. So
just quickly, what is Svelte for those people who haven't heard of it?
Right. So Svelte is a alternative framework compared to like React, Vue, or Angular. It's a front end framework, and it relies on the compiler to basically bundle up your JavaScript code and spew out your front end application. And one thing that is really different about Svelte compared to React or Vue is that it doesn't rely on the virtual DOM. So you can imagine Svelte like an Excel sheet where you have a bunch of cells, and these cells have formulas that rely on other cells. So say imagine this one part of your application changes, then it's only going to change because you made some different changes on a different cell. But with the way that React and Vue work, it has to compare everything all at once. It goes, did this change? Did this change? Did this change? If it did change, then you change that. I could definitely go down this rabbit hole about Svelte, but and how it's different from React and Vue. But there is actually a really good video by Rich Harris, who created Svelte, about reactivity. And this is something that I just thought was super interesting as a front end dev, because it's so easy to just say, oh, React is great because Facebook, and Vue is great because community support driven, but sometimes it's good to see how other people approach front end development. That's how I get myself to constantly learn. And so for this course, I want to kind of teach how to build a Svelte app and how you can use the front end framework called Sapper, which is kind of the equivalent of like Next.js with Svelte, to build something very simple. So
cool. So are you planning on launching? What platform are you planning on launching it on?
So I think I'm planning on launching it on Teachable, and I'm going to connect it to my domain, and then create a subdomain with that. Yeah.
Awesome. So you're going your own way with it. You're not even going to fuss with Udemy or whatever else.
Well, one thing that is really awesome about having a lot of YouTubers that have paved the way forward is you kind of see, you get the experience from them, and they kind of express their frustrations with certain platforms as creators. Yeah, I see. Yeah. So I don't want to. So I just learn from the people that teach me. I'm always learning about not just coding, but in general. Teachable seems like the best approach for me right now.
Awesome. Okay, we have a question from Rishab. Question: I am stuck in tutorial hell. How can I get out of it?
You gotta watch some of these RTC videos.
I don't know if those videos are helping or hurting to get out of tutorial hell.
No. So there are a few ways to do this. I've been actually watching also, I don't know if you know Coder Foundry videos, but
oh yeah, he has the C# boot camp. Is that right?
C# boot camp, yeah. Okay. But he also talked about Yelp Camp, the Cold Steel course, and I know you talked about it as well. I think the first thing that you can do is take a finished application and make modifications as necessary, right? Add a new model, add a new data layer, CSS, or style it up. Instead of doing Yelp or like locations, use maybe like an art museum that has a bunch of pictures in it, things like that. Get yourself kind of acquainted with that first. And then the next thing is build what you want to build. Start off somewhere with whatever you're interested in. I think that's a really good motivation for you to start your own project. And use the same technologies that you used in the tutorial. And if you find yourself running into roadblocks and things like that, you could always refer back to your old Udemy videos, or there's also google.com and Stack Overflow. So I literally sometimes just copy the error, paste it on Google, and then the first thing that pops up is the solution. So I would start off that way and try to find a mentor too. I think that's very underutilized. And how you can do that is there's some online mentor websites that are out there. Also, you can, if you have friends or family that are software developers that can help out, that's another good way to use the resources, or meetup.com.
Right. And it's okay to have more than one mentor too. Like I've definitely taken advantage of that. People, whether it's people approaching me like, hey, do you need a mentor, or me reaching out to people, the more free help you can get, the more free expert help you can get, why not? Like take
Exactly.
advantage of that. And they can, it sure beats like paying someone 125 bucks an hour for a consultation when they're gonna be working with you and working directly with you. So
Yeah, one thing good about this community, I know some developers are super busy, but we're a pretty giving community, I noticed. And there are a lot of people that are 5 to 10 years experience that want to help out. They just don't know how to do it. So you just got to find your way and find those type of mentors for sure.
exactly. Yes. And speaking of which, shameless plug, if one of the YouTube live chat mods could post the Discord, we have a Real Tough Candy Discord. We have about getting close to 1,000 members now. And as Tech Rally mentioned, there are people with experience, there are people just starting out, and we have some great conversations. So check out the Discord. Also, let's go to the next question. I had one up here, tutorial. Okay, Christoph wants to know, what projects can you do to really stand out from the crowd to get hired for your first job?
Projects. That's a great question. I think the first thing you definitely need to do is have some kind of backend. And I'm not going to talk about specific like projects that you can work on, but having a backend with an authentication flow, that's like a minimum requirement in my opinion. And then having some type of front end framework, whether it's React, Vue, Angular, whatever. And before you even do that, I would just research in your area what people are looking for, right? I say React Vue or Angular, but if in your area they're looking for PHP developers with jQuery, and you have experience in there, then don't learn a completely new framework. Just start with your PHP and jQuery because that's what employers are looking for.
Right.
And I'm just gonna steal from the Coder Foundry guys, and what they recommend is a bug tracker. And I think that's actually a really, really great idea. And someone did show the demo of their bug tracker, and it was super impressive. They had all the relationships and how you can give admin access and how you could remove admin access, things like that. I thought that was really amazing and very impressive to me. Another thing that I would consider beyond just project ideas is make sure people can look at your application, as in make sure your application is on production and live. Because as a recruiter, I probably wouldn't want to open up a GitHub repo and then download it and see it locally. So you
Right.
have to make it very accessible to make sure like you get eyes on it. And if you can, just if you're not a front end CSS person and you don't know how to style too well, then just buy a theme from Bootstrap and make it look pretty. I think that's a lot of times recruiters like things that are pretty. And
Right. Yeah. And there's no shame. I know, well, for me early on too, and a lot of other people I've talked to, it's like, is this cheating? Is using Bootstrap like a sin? It's not. It's just, it's making your job easier. And if you can use these tools to get you the job or get you where you need to be, go for it. If you don't excel at something, there's no sense in torturing yourself if you don't excel at something or you don't enjoy it. And just
right.
focus on, what you do enjoy, what you want to succeed at, rather than trying to take it all on yourself. So
Yeah, and this goes back to just learning the most minimum amount that you can to get you a job, right? Like it just makes sense in my opinion.
this is a question not from the audience, but just to follow up on what we've been talking about. At what point do you think the typical junior developer should start applying to jobs?
I think at minimum you need to have a few projects under your belt before you start applying to jobs, because if you have nothing to showcase, then that's probably a bad sign. I saw someone on a forum post like, I'm finishing up this Udemy tutorial and I'm kind of scared that I might not be able to I may not be able to apply to jobs. And I said, yeah, I agree, because you don't have your own personal projects yet.
Right, right.
So I think from that point on, in my opinion, you're ready to apply to jobs. And I would do a lot of research, see what kind of job you're applying to, because sometimes people do express kind of discontent that, hey, I prepared my interview by studying algorithms, but they tested me on completely something different, like a front end application. He's like, well, what kind of job did you apply for? It was like, oh, it was a front end React position. It's like, yeah, they might test you on React stuff and not on algorithms.
Right.
So you just got to make sure you have a few portfolio applications, and then from that point on, just make sure you have a pretty decent GitHub and shows that you have some activity going and things like that.
Okay, so here's kind of a related question. We're talking about the stacks. This question is from ASDFJKL. What do you think of the Mern and Maven stacks, and how will they prepare people for junior dev jobs? So many new people are learning those two stacks. So Mern, Mongo Express React Node, and Maven, Mongo Express Vue and Node. What do you think of those?
So personally, for me, I'm going to just dissect. I mean, I made a video about this, about React and Vue. And yes, there are a lot of people learning it, but you also have to consider that a lot of people are looking for those people with those skills. So you have to learn what people are looking for. So I personally would recommend more on the Mern stack than the MEVN stack, I don't know, Maven stack.
Yeah, I guess. I don't that's what I say. I don't know. It could be Maven, Movin. I don't know.
Yeah. But I mean, I was so surprised because when I looked at on Indeed on React jobs, there was about 30,000 listed. And then when I looked up Vue job, there was about 2,000. So that's a pretty big discrepancy. And,
yeah,
you know, like it is really cool that there's a community driven front end framework and things like that. But if employers aren't looking for Vue developers, then it might not be worth, at least as a starting developer or aspiring developer, it might be more wise to spend your time on just one framework. And I personally would recommend the Mern stack more. And I know you have a few opinions about Mongo versus like Postgres and things like that. So maybe if you watch a few of the RTC videos on that one, she explains very well about why Postgres is more applicable in like startups and even the corporate level businesses. Yeah.
Cool. Okay, so kind of following up, we talked about this a little bit, but just to go back to it and explore it a little more, another question from ASDFJKL. What do you think are the biggest and most common gaps in new developer skills? Things that new developers should know, but don't?
Personally, for me, I think it's Git. And it's very hard to use Git if you're not working in a team.
Exactly.
Yeah. So like the idea of branching out and creating some like work or flow for something that you don't want to commit to your master yet, that can only work when you join a team. So I will give you a pass if you don't know Git as well, because it is very hard when you're just working on a solo. You're still mostly going to be working on master. But in general, as you get more experience, you're going to have to know Git. And another thing about new and aspiring developers, the holes, or that's a great question. I think sometimes they just they just memorize, right? So that idea of understanding concepts is very lacking at times, because even coming from a coding boot camp, you're very rushed and it's like, do this, do that, do this, do that. And like, you're like, but I didn't like register and all that information in my head yet. But sometimes there are those gaps where you just know how to do it, but you don't know why you do it that way. So it's like, even when I was interviewing junior developers at our company, I would be like, okay, so like, why are you doing this? Like when they're like setting the state or something like that. And they couldn't really give me a good answer because there's just like, oh, it's just out of habit that we're supposed to do it this way, right? So
you think, would you say, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, go ahead, yeah.
So would you say more like critical thinking? You'd like to see some more critical thinking about developer choices?
Right. I like to, I mean, and I totally get it though, why it might not be as high priority, because you're just trying to learn everything. But but to my point about just kind of breathing and kind of rewinding back, just thinking about why certain things work the way they do, it really makes it a lot easier when you go through that interview process. Because I think a lot of new developers, they freak out because you might get tested on something you weren't prepared for. But as a developer, it's not about how much you memorized. It's about how do you take the few concepts that you know and apply it to whatever project you're working on. And that's how I would even approach interview. Like, of course you should be prepared and try to memorize certain things, but be prepared for stuff that you might not know, and just be prepared to ask questions and try to problem solve. Essentially, problem solving skills is what you do as a software developer.
So to follow up on that, this is a question I have for you. What advice would you give to someone, a junior at an interview? They're doing good at the interview, the communication is great, but then they're asked a question they don't have experience with. What advice would you give to them to get through that pain point of not knowing?
Yeah, just be honest and say, I'm not as familiar with this tech stack, or I'm not as I have no experience using this, but I have used something similar, and explain how you used it in your projects. And then we might get into a potential like whiteboarding situation. Yeah, the syntax might not be correct, but at least if you can explain your thoughts on how you did it with what you know, and maybe we could just apply to, okay, and I could be like, okay, so this person has very good critical thinking skills. It's not about the stuff that you don't know. At least we could have a conversation, and you could figure out like you could figure out a single approach, or you could figure out multiple approaches. Generally, when I'm hiring junior developers, I don't expect you to know everything. It's just I just want you to know. I just want to know that you know how to think a little bit and think about certain skills. That's what's most important to me.
Okay, excellent. Vesselin says, I'm about to apply to a few companies for internship as a front-end developer. My problem is, how do I overcome the fear of failure and not getting the position?
So it's super funny. In my Gmail account, I have a little like folder called rejections. So those are all the emails that I've gotten rejections from.
Ooh,
And it's one of those things where you just it's really hard to say. Each person handles it very differently, but I think you just take it as a learning experience if you get rejected, because eventually one will hit. And for every one that you do get rejected, try to kind of think back and think about why you got rejected, right? Was it because you didn't do that coding challenge very well? Was it because you weren't able to explain certain concepts very well? And then you could go back to the drawing board and practice those things. I wouldn't really put yourself down for getting rejected, because even as a senior developer, I got rejected plenty of times, and that's just part of the process. Because I mean, I'm going to name drop another YouTuber that I follow, like Ben Awad, says that the coding interviews are broken, right? So because you really don't know what people are going to interview on, and maybe someone's having a bad day that day, and it's not your fault, right? So I know it's a lot more daunting as a junior developer, because there are a lot less opportunities. But try to try to rewind back and figure out what mistakes were made and how you can improve on the next one. And then you just got to keep going.
that's just it. Yeah, you just can't. Everyone who applies is gonna get those rejection letters, and they're never fun. Like they suck. They can be embarrassing. They can be just depressing. But what I was doing, I kind of had a similar thing going with you with the rejection thing. I have tech journals. And so in this particular tech journal, I was noting these jobs I was applying to, my process for applying and why I didn't get the job, or why I thought I didn't get the job. I was like, okay, maybe I need to focus more on this technology, or I need to focus on communicating this better. And it's a process of just finessing yourself, where all you got to do is convince one person to take a chance on you. And then after that, you're going to be just fine. So you just got to find that one person. And if you can do that, you got the job, you got the internship. But you just got, like you said, you just got to keep going, and you're going to get rejection letters, and they stink. They're never fun, but there's a company out there who will take a chance on a new person. There's lots of them. There are lots of companies waiting for junior developers to come join their team. So.
Right. And for people that are self-employed, self-taught developers or aspiring developers, I would say even in the interview process itself, I would go above and beyond what is normally expected of an interviewee. So whether that be, if someone gave you a take-home challenge to do some coding exercise and they gave you the minimum requirements, maybe go above and beyond that. Add a few more data models, or add a bootstrap theme on top of it, make it look pretty, show that you actually want the job, right? I think a lot of times mid to senior level developers, they get a little bit, full of themselves. So they don't want to, coding challenge, I don't want to do that. But when you're a junior, an aspiring developer, you kind of have to differentiate yourself. So going above and beyond with the take home challenges and researching the company and being like, oh yeah, like you can name drop certain projects that they worked on. It really just shows that you're interested in the company. And this is especially true for junior developers because, like I said before, I understand, for me, when I'm interviewing juniors, I understand you're not going to be the best developer, but if you show me that you know what our company does and you have done the research and you could kind of code a little bit, like we're gonna work with you and groom you to become a better developer. But if you come in with no idea what we do and you just sit there and like, don't ask questions and things like that, it makes me feel like, hey, maybe you don't want to work here.
Right. You didn't care enough to take, 10 minutes out just to see what we do and stuff. And that does make such a difference. Like, not just the first impressions, but the fact that someone invested time in their life to find out more about you. And that's, 10 times out of 10, that makes a huge difference, that candidate isn't just like blindly applying, blindly going to these interviews, but does have an interest for that company and does have an interest in adding value. And that matters. Like, interviewers pick up on that really quickly.
Yeah, there's so many intangibles that that a lot of coders don't consider. They just think solely on the code itself, but your body language, everything like that is super important as well. Like if you show that you're excited to be at this interview and you want to ask a million questions, of course, yeah, that's a really good experience. Yeah. And generally, awesome. if you're like that and you're doing a coding challenge, live person coding challenge, the interviewer wants to help you. So you just have a conversation and we'll work on it together.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to transition. This is a complete transition of a question here, but Leno Mora wants to know what can an experienced C++ developer do to make the change and get a new job as a web developer?
I would say learn JavaScript. That's probably the first thing I would do. And for a C++ developer to learn JavaScript, that should be easy. The next thing I would do is learn CSS. And after that, you pick a front-end framework and work from there. The transition from a C++ to JavaScript should be super easy. And then the hard part will just be understanding the syntax of a front-end framework and knowing your CSS and Sass.
Okay. Developers, we have a few minutes left of this interview with Tech Rally. Thank you so much for coming on today, Tech Rally. He is not only a senior developer, he is also rocking his own YouTube channel, and he is a member of the RTC Discord. I wanted to reach out to him because he is not only rocking it, he's got a lot of good advice to give for people entering the industry, and he's working. He has a job, he's employed. So you have a lot of different experience with juniors and mid-level and all sorts of stuff. So if you have a question, developers, get it in right now. We may or may not be able to get to it. That's all I got to say with that. Let's go to this. This is a great question. Digital Rower says, is there a way to get experience with Git working in a team without having a job? Any recommendations on how to get experience doing merges, resolving conflicts, etc.?
So when I was attending a coding bootcamp school, that was a little bit easier because you're forced to work on projects with 3 to 4 people. But if you are a self-taught developer, I would go out and reach out to any other aspiring developers. I think a lot of times, even free code camp, there's so many people doing it individually, but I don't know why people don't ping each other and be like, hey, do you want to work on a project together? And in that way, you can gain that experience of using Git and GitHub and branching, resolving merge conflicts and things like that. Yeah, obviously it's very hard to get everyone on the same page, but if you have any friends that are coding with you and you guys want to work on a project together, that could be another way to do it. But yeah, I realize a lot of times working on a project is very like solo focused, especially as a self-taught developer. But just because it's hard doesn't mean it's impossible. So try out different ways. Yeah.
Okay, we got 2 more questions here, and then we are going to wind it down. This question is from Scott Foley. In this JavaScript world, I'm a PHP guy. I'm trying to figure out, is there still hope for me in the job market with PHP? What are your thoughts?
I think so. I mean, while I was doing the research on my last video, I searched the PHP jobs, and there was still about 16,000 jobs looking for PHP developers. So I mean, as much as people want to make fun of, oh, is PHP dead and things like that, the reality is it's not, and people are still using technologies. Granted, I live in New York, so we do kind of embrace a lot of the newer technologies, but that doesn't necessarily mean like you can't use PHP in somewhere else, right? And just like that, this is why it's so funny, because a lot of times people debate about certain technologies, but to me, it's learn what you need to get the job done. That's what's most important to me.
Right. Yeah, I mean, YouTube, I think a big wake up for me was realizing, so as myself, a self-taught developer, I spent a lot of time on YouTube looking at these videos and different perspectives and different styles. I was watching like the heavy data structures and algorithm Google style channels. And then I was watching like the homegrown self-developer channels, and then seeing all these different things and not really realizing that all of these languages are valid. It all depends on the context. Like, what's actually going to get me paid? Is it going to be Ruby on Rails? Probably not in my area. So that's when I was like, okay, I need to stop watching Ruby on Rails videos, even though it's pretty cool. Like, it's not going to help me get a job. So yeah, like the local job market is important, and PHP, at least, I mean, people like to bag on it because it's old, it's crusty, whatever. But I mean, I could go on a tangent with that, but there are plenty of PHP jobs, plus WordPress stuff if you're interested in going that route. And with YouTube, it really is an entertainment platform. So when people make these ridiculous titles, it's to get clicks. Whether it's my channel or someone else, it's because we want people to watch the videos, not necessarily because it's the absolute source of truth for everyone's situation. And we talk about our own experiences too, and people's mileage is going to vary on that depending on where you live and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes we have, as experienced developers, we have some kind of responsibility to steer newer developers in the right direction. But it's hard because it is interesting to talk about these things and debate about those things. But sometimes I think new developers get swarmed into this like rabbit hole of a debate, and then 3 weeks later they haven't done anything. And that
because
could
it's
be
a distraction.
problem.
Yeah, there's so many
distraction, yeah.
distractions on not just YouTube, but like we were talking earlier, just so many technologies. And people who are like me, who find it all interesting, it's hard to know when you should cut yourself off and actually go back to focus on what's gonna give you income, what's gonna give you happiness, what's gonna get you ahead, rather than spending 8 hours like watching the finer debate points on PHP versus Node or something. And those are really entertaining videos. But at the end of the day, for people who are seeking jobs, at least, we gotta cut ourselves off. And I know how hard it is to cut ourselves off from the entertaining stuff.
Right,
so
right.
Let's go. I got time for one more question. Jean had a question up here. Where was it? Jean wants to know, what is your opinion on specializing versus being a generalist as a web developer?
Yeah, that's something I've always kind of internally debated with. I consider myself a front-end developer, and that's because I've been around very, very smart back-end developers, right? And that's not a fault of my own. Like I said before, I can make APIs, but do I consider myself a back-end developer? Probably not. And that's because when I talk to our back-end team guys, they're thinking about microservices and like Redis and caching and everything like that, things that I don't do on a daily basis. And they enjoy doing that, and that, to all the power to them. But for me, I really like working on the front end, seeing a lot of like user interface and things like that. In terms of full stack versus front end or back end, some people say even the full stack developer is kind of dead because even the front end has gotten so complicated. But I could see that there's a lot more appeal for aspiring developer to put the full stack web developer as their kind of title when applying to jobs. So I get, you got to play the game a little bit, but I think as you get more experience, like me, 4 or 5 years, 6 years experience, you start just gravitating towards one side of the tech over the other. But even like when I built my portfolio site, I still had to create APIs. I still had to do the front end. Like that's for my own personal projects, but on a daily, I generally like to gravitate towards the front end. That's what I enjoy doing. But yeah, full stack developer, there are a few unicorns out there, but it's not as many as it used to be because the technology has evolved so much on the front end and the back end as well.
Right. And I talked about this a few months ago. I don't remember if it was a live stream or what, but just noting that at least as a, well, even in boot camps too, the educational materials are all pushing full stack. So whether you want to be back end or front end doesn't matter, because the most popular ones, you're going to be learning both of those areas. And so I think they're like, you know, the Cold Steel boot camp teaches back end, front end, all the online boot camp or online boot camp style courses. I don't know any boot camps, at least in the States, that do strictly front end. Like, you're learning everything. And I think that's just, it's kind of I don't know if it's a trend or a push or what, but I really didn't realize, like, at first there was a choice between back end and front end, because all the courses that I was seeing was all of it. So
Yeah, I think that makes sense, at least when you're starting off, to get exposed to both front end and back end and just really understand how web technology works, right? I think that's kind of the purpose behind it.
right.
But like I said, as you get more experience, you do start gravitating towards one over the other, and that's just, or at least that's what I found that I enjoy. But at least when you're starting off, when you're interviewing for positions, you want to interview for as many positions as you can. So whether it's a back end positions or front end position, I don't think 3 months or 4 months is enough time for you to know, like, I'm going to be a front end developer or I'm going to be a back end developer. At that point, you're kind of like a sponge that will just learn anything that's given to you. And that's
Right.
yeah.
And just discover, it's a discovery process too, you know, finding out
Exactly.
what you do. Like there were things I never even knew existed that I found out, like, oh, I think this is really neat. I like this. These API, like testing APIs, like, this is a really dry, like, procedural type of thing, but I really like it. And I never, you know, when you're starting out, you're like, what the heck's an API? But as you get into it, you're like, oh, this is what it is, and this is how I work with it, and this is how I test it, and this is how I build it. And so it really is a process. And like, you know, we've been talking this whole video, it doesn't end. Your development journey doesn't end after boot camp, and it doesn't end after, you know, Udemy course 10. It's a continuous thing. And even, you know, talking about how your learning journey has changed, like, you're still learning. It's
Right.
just changed over to, you know, more documentation, and then reading something and like, okay, let's go implement this, or plan to implement it. So
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, and
Okay.
I'm so thankful still for doing full stack development in the beginning and learning full stack, because I could still have conversations with back end people. Like, even though I may not be doing it, I could, like, from a high level, it's like being a PM. You kind of know at a high level what is actually happening, but you're not really doing it yourself, right? So
Right.
yeah.
Okay, developers, Tech Rally live on the RealToughCandy channel. Tech Rally, thanks for coming on the show. Is there anything else you want to add, or I missed, or any shout outs, anything? What you got?
No, I think that's it. Obviously, thankful for anyone that comes to my channels and subscribe, and I appreciate that. I'll try to provide as much content as I can. If you have any questions, you know, you could always ping me on Twitter, email, and things like that.
Cool. Yeah. For one last time, for people who didn't find it, Paradoodly Doo or Sarah, could you plug his YouTube channel in the live chat? He is doing videos applicable to new developers, talking about different things, career stuff, technologies, all sorts of stuff. So, Tech Rally, thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you,
Appreciate it.
RTC. Appreciate the time.
All right, we're on Zoom, so this is going to be, as always, an awkward ending. So I'm going to log off, and I'll see everyone in the next video. Thanks, Tech Rally.